Hi, Professor McMurtry.
Just Angus is fine.
Okay, Angus, I have some questions about the first two chapters in Engaging Minds, chapters 1 and 2, dealing with the emergence of standardized education. One thing I don't get is why the authors are telling us about it. Do they actually like these old education practices?
One thing that I should emphasize at the start is that the authors aren't endorsing standardized education. They just want to show us where a lot of society's assumptions about education come from. Although most of us would now disagree with many aspects of standardized education, it can still be seen in our educational institutions and popular media interpretations of teaching. The authors present standardized education as a fusion of traditional Western views about knowledge, rooted in Greek, medieval, and Enlightenment thinking on the one hand, and the Industrial Revolution and factories that played such a big role in our society a few hundred years ago on the other, back when modern mass schooling was developed. From traditional Western thinking, we get the idea that the world and universe are out there, orderly and stable, and that learning is about taking in or representing these truths inside our head boxes. This is sometimes referred to as correspondence theory. Greek and medieval philosophers tended to talk about spiritual truths or ideal forms and the like, while post-enlightenment thinkers focused more on taking in practical information or facts about the world. In the industrial era, factories were the biggest new form of production and social organization. So when modern mass education was developed, factory-like ideas were very influential. We came to see schooling as needing to be orderly, efficient, and predictable, just like how things are made on assembly lines. Although the way people talk about education became more mechanical during the Industrial Revolution, the underlying metaphor that learning was about acquiring knowledge or skills, as though they were some kind of immaterial object, that metaphor remained the same. So our conceptions of learning and education are actually rooted in particular histories. This is what the authors want to draw our attention to, as well as the fact that we should not take them as unchangeable or given, but rather imagine and try out other possibilities. We will learn more about these other possibilities in the coming moments.
Okay, I can see how these historical developments shape how we think about learning and knowing, but it's still pretty abstract. What did this actually mean for teaching and education?
We will get more into the practical educational implications next week in chapter 1.3, but I want to spend a little more time on the theoretical stuff because we take so many of these standardized ideas as truths. We just assume them and are not even aware of how much they condition how we think about learning and teaching. That makes it tougher to understand other newer approaches like constructivism or critical pedagogy because they don't make sense within these old frames of thinking. Okay, here's one crucial assumption that standardized education makes, one that is still accepted uncritically by most journalists and politicians. Knowledge is understood as a manufacturable, possessible object. Learning is usually described in terms of acquisition, for example, acquiring knowledge or acquiring skills, or in terms of visual metaphors like seeing the light or enlightenment. As I mentioned above, education is assumed to be like factory-based production, requiring orderly, linear, and step-by-step standardized sequences. And learning is understood in terms of whether or not there is a match between the world outside our heads and the representations inside our heads. Finally, from the standardized perspective, learners are understood to be isolated individuals who are deficient somehow and need to have their heads filled up with the right knowledge. Please note again that the authors aren't supporting these views. They just think it's important to know where we came from and the assumptions that many people still have about education. They will be articulating alternatives in moments 2, 3, and 4. Spoiler alert, the authors like more biological and organic metaphors to talk about learning. They compare learning to more to the way species adapt to their environments, but that's a topic for future weeks.
The authors use two general terms to describe standardized theories of learning: mentalism and behaviorism. What do those mean?
Many people have heard of behaviorism, but the term mentalism is one that the authors use to cover a variety of traditional assumptions about learning that have been a background assumption about learning for literally thousands of years in the West. In mentalism, Learning is seen as a matter of assembling an inner representation or mental model that corresponds to the external world. The metaphors evolve with technology, with the insides of our heads containing blank slates or paintings, and more recently, movie screens or computer like information storage. But the core metaphor of the head as an information container remains much the same. One thing this theory is not very good at explaining is how different students may interpret the same experiences significantly differently. To explain that, you need to go into other theories, such as constructivism, which we will look at in more detail in the authentic education section of the book. Another big learning theory associated with standardized perspectives is behaviorism. In the early 20th century, physicists and chemists were having a lot of success with the scientific method. So, psychologists and other people who study education tried to apply the same approach to learning. That is, focus on behaviors that you can observe and measure. Everything else, like subjective mental states, is just speculation. From a behaviorist perspective, the goal of education is to provide the right environmental inputs so that students are conditioned or trained to do what societies and teachers want them to do as outputs. Be productive citizens and workers and so on. From our perspective, this may seem like an oppressive approach to education, but in the early 20th century, behaviorism was actually seen as progressive because it asserted that people were equal and anyone could be trained to do anything. This contrasted with the widespread snobbery that existed before, in which poor people were seen to be destined by bad breeding to be inferior.
It's really interesting to hear about this history. I always thought that learning and knowing were things we understood and that science or psychology had stated the final word on them. But I guess those concepts are actually debated and shaped by history, society, and so forth. Is that what the authors are trying to say?
Yes, exactly. And as we will see in future moments in this book, ideas about learning, knowing, and teaching are always already entangled with developments in the wider world, both society and culture, and biology and ecology. So, just to emphasize, the point that the authors are trying to make is we should really try to understand and question assumptions about learning, knowing, and teaching. If we remain unaware of these assumptions, taking them as just the way things are, then we will never be able to explore alternatives. It is true that the questioning assumptions makes most people uncomfortable. After all, we all love our illusions. But as educators, we have a duty to examine our assumptions about education.